Hello, and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. Today's episode is on a reconnaissance seaplane because, let's be honest, they just don't get a whole lot of love or affection. To the contemporary student of aviation who might never have seen one in action, the seaplane might seem like an anachronism that is hard to relate to. However, especially when it comes to their service in the anti-submarine role, the Sunderland should be appreciated. We should remember that Prime Minister Winston Churchill said that the U-boat peril was the only thing that ever really frightened him during the Second World War. Design and development. In the years between the wars, there was intense competition between several nations to establish airlines and air routes across the planet. Of course, the UK wished to set up and maintain links to the far reaches of its distant empire. It was for this reason that Imperial Airways was set up to link the British Empire with service to South Africa, India, Australia, Malaya, and Hong Kong. This pioneering company merged into the British Overseas Airways Corporation, BOAC, in 1939, and eventually became British Airways in 1974. The logo for Imperial Airways was a very stylized image of two birds, one red and one black, flying in formation. This was known as the Speedbird logo, and British Airways flights today are still known by the Speedbird call sign. For a sea power like the British Empire, it was natural to start using existing seaports to serve flying boats to create their air service. It was for this purpose that in the 1930s, Imperial Airways challenged British manufacturers to build a fleet of 28 large flying boats. Each of these monsters could weigh 18 tons, carry 24 passengers, and needed to have a range of 700 miles or 1,100 kilometers. At around the same time, the British Air Ministry published Specification R233, which requested a next-generation, long-range, general-purpose flying boat for ocean reconnaissance work. It could be either a monoplane or biplane, and had to perform at least equal to the short Sarafand flying boat. There were a variety of requirements, including that the new airplane was to be powered by no more than 4 engines. The Short brothers of Belfast, Northern Ireland, had built the S-14 Short Sarafand flying boat in 1932. It was powered by 6 Rolls-Royce Buzzard engines that were mounted in a tractor-pusher configuration in 3 nacelles between the wings. It was an experimental aircraft, but the RAF operated it for 4 years and then it was scrapped. On a side note, marketing-wise, Buzzard seems like a terrible name for an aircraft engine. Speaking of birds, the Short brothers decided that they could kill 2 birds with 1 stone and get both the civilian and military contracts by building one basic design and developing both planes from it. They started work in October 1934 and settled on a shoulder-wing monoplane with 4 engines for both versions. They designated the civilian plane the S-23 and the military one the S-25. Shorts had some competition for the military contract when Saunders Roe announced that they were also building a flying boat, which was called the Saro A-33. Following submissions to the Air Ministry, funds were released to build prototypes from both Saunders Roe and Shorts. Once built, these would be used for testing and evaluation, and the winning design would be chosen. Let's fast forward 2 years, and Shorts was having great success with putting together their submission for the competition. So much so that the ministry placed 11 more orders before the competition actually started. In the end, Shorts won the competition by default when Saunders Roe's sole A-33 suffered a structural failure during taxi tests and was destroyed. Meanwhile, in July 1936, the first version of the civilian design with tail number Golf Alpha Delta Hotel Lima and named Canopus flew successfully. These were to be known as Empire flying boats. Shorts ended up building 42 of them, and they operated all over the world, and even though they were built as civilians, some of them even ended up being drafted during World War II, and serving with the Royal Air Force, Royal Australian Air Force, Royal New Zealand Air Force, and Royal Canadian Air Force. It took a little longer for the prototype of the military version to be prepared. However, by October 1937, Kilo 4774 was ready for her test flight, and a name had been chosen for the type, the Sunderland, which was a fitting name taken from the port town of Sunderland in northeast England. Prototypes. On the 16th of October 1937, the prototype Sunderland took to the skies for the first time. It was using 950 horsepower Bristol Pegasus 10 radial engines, because the planned 1010 horsepower Bristol Pegasus 22 radial engines were not yet ready. The design was declared essentially sound, although a few changes were requested before the aircraft would be accepted for operational use. The sweep back of the wing was adjusted in order to move the center of lift of the aircraft, and some other tinkering was done to improve the handling of the aircraft on the water. Finally, more armament was requested, and the aircraft was to receive the aforementioned new and more powerful engines. Production. Over 700 Sunderlands were built, organized into several marks. 75 Sunderland Mark I's were built. The majority of them were constructed at Short's factories at Rochester and Belfast, Northern Ireland, and 15 were built by Blackburn Aircraft. In August 1941, the Sunderland Mark II received Pegasus 18 engines, which featured two-speed superchargers, which generated 1,065 horsepower each. The 4-gun rear turret was modified to carry double the amount of ammunition with 1,000 rounds per gun, rather than the original 500. Some later Mark IIs received a FN-7 dorsal turret with twin 303 machine guns. 42 of this mark were built. The Mark III would be the definitive Sunderland, with almost 500 planes of this type being built. Like some people, warbirds tend to get fat during their operational lives as new equipment and weapons are added, either at the factory or by field modification. This was happening to the Sunderland, and as a result, the plane was beginning to have difficulty unsticking from the water during its takeoff run. The Mark III received changes to its step in the hull to better allow for release from the waves. The Mark III would also receive more guns, including 2 fixed guns that could be aimed and fired by the pilot like a very big fighter plane during a strafing run. The type also received provisions for more ammunition, more bombs, and more depth charges. In 1942, the Air Ministry was thinking about service in the Pacific and began preparing for the eventual replacement of the Sunderland, and so published Specification R842, which was basically requesting a new and improved Sunderland with more powerful Bristol Hercules engines and more defensive weapons. Starting off as the Mark IV, it would eventually have so many changes that it was decided to give it a whole new name, which was the S-45 Seaford. The Seaford's fuselage was longer, benefited from a stronger wing, larger tailplanes, and more hull form changes again. The Seaford had a beefed-up armament with 50 cal machine guns and 20mm Hispano cannon. The Air Ministry ordered 30 Seafords, and 8 were built, but these arrived on the scene too late to see combat. The weight creep that I mentioned before was the cause of the introduction of the Mark V. With wartime Sunderlands putting on the pounds with more and more weapons, ammo, and radar, the Pegasus engines had to be run at higher and higher power settings just to make do. These engines also could not be feathered, which was very problematic when you had an engine failure. Crews were burning out engines at an alarming rate, and eventually some Australian crews requested that the Pegasus engines be swapped out by more powerful American Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp engines. These new engines were also equipped with the new Hamilton Hydromatic constant speed fully feathering propellers, which boosted performance and maintained range. A major improvement was that a Sunderland equipped with twin Wasps could remain flying and get back to base if two engines happened to be knocked out on the same wing. Sunderlands with the old Pegasus engines in the same circumstances could not maintain altitude and would eventually end up in the drink. 155 Sunderlands were built in this configuration with the American engines, with a further 33 converted from the earlier Mark IIIs. Check out part 2 for operational history, and if you haven't subscribed, now would be the time. Until next time.